right, guys, we're ready to start chapter 9. When we had just left off in chapter 8, it had snowed, it covered everything, but he realized that would make it very easy for him to track the animals that he needed to hunt and catch to survive. And it says that now he's about to find the moose. And I'm wondering if that's the same moose from before that tried to kill him. So let's see. Chapter 9. He prepared for hunting by putting his hatchet and knife on his belt and one of the butane lighters in his pocket. He started to take the light bow, but thought that he might see something big and wanted to take a shot, and so took the war bow under the theory that he could shoot something small with the big bow, but he couldn't shoot a deer with the small bow. So he took the large bow and the new lance and 5 arrows with stone points and went hunting. At the start, he almost couldn't hunt. The woods were so beautiful, so changed. It was a whole different world, and that he walked slowly along and feasted his eyes on first one scene and then another. It should all be framed, he thought, framed in some way to take back. Take back. He hadn't thought that in a long while either. Pictures of home were fading. But if he could show this to his mother, he thought, just for her to see this. He shook his head and almost at the same instant saw a rabbit. It was sitting under an overhanging evergreen limb, back in the shadow, but still very easy to see because it was brown. On its back there were several white spots, each about as large as a silver dollar. Brian had seen several rabbits with similar white spots and had thought that they were some kind of fluke or mutation, but he guessed now that they actually changed color in the winter and became white so that they wouldn't be so visible. Without it, Brian thought, they were dead meat. A week or so earlier, he had walked through and seen 1 rabbit in this area. He now took 20 steps and saw 7, all at varying ranges, none close enough to shoot, all standing out like sore thumbs because they were brown against the white snow. He moved easily, slowly, waiting for a close shot. When it came, a rabbit not more than 20 feet away, he shot carefully and only missed by a hair, actually cutting the fur along the top of the rabbit's shoulders. The rabbit dodged left and right and vanished in the underbrush, and Brian went forward to get his arrow. At first, he couldn't find it. He'd seen it fly, had seen exactly where it went into the snow. There was a hole marking the arrow's entry, but it wasn't there. He dug in the snow, but still couldn't find it, and didn't find it until he'd stepped back and lined up the flight of the arrow and worked along the snow, scooping it out every foot. The arrow had gone more than 30 feet after entering the snow, skittering along beneath the surface before coming to rest. He'd have to be careful of his shots, he thought, pulling it out and blowing the snow off its feathers. He'd lose all his arrows on one hunt. He moved on, still taken by the beauty, and had 3 more shots, all of which he missed because the targets were so small. Rabbits, and he wasn't used to shooting the heavier bow yet. I'll have to get closer, he thought, work right up on them, get into the thicker brush. He slowed his pace even more and moved into a large stand of brambles and thick young evergreens packed so closely he couldn't see more than 10 feet, and only by crouching down and looking along the ground. It was hard going. Every limb pulled at the bow, and he had to be careful not to wreck the feathers on the arrows as he moved. Hang on. Sorry, guys. I had an itch. There were rabbits everywhere. The snow was covered with their tracks, and he had moved nearly 50 yards into the thick brush when the sound of a breaking limb stopped him cold. Rabbits and foolbirds did not break limbs when they moved. Deer broke limbs. Bear broke limbs. Almost simultaneously, he saw different tracks in the snow in front of him. Big tracks. Huge tracks. The hair went up on his neck. They were big enough for Bear, and what he really didn't want to do in his whole life was meet a bear in thick brush, especially if it was a bear that had a memory of a bad night with a skunk. But when he leaned down to study the tracks, he saw they had a cloven hoof, like those left by deer, but larger, much larger. Moose. He knew instantly. He had seen moose several times since he had been attacked last summer. Once he had seen a bull with a rack so large Brian could easily have fit between the antlers. The rest had been cows. They were all unbelievably big, and after he'd been attacked by the cow along the lake, he'd given them a wide berth. When they got angry, it was like having a Buick mad at you. And for those of you that don't know, a Buick, it's a brand of a car. They don't make many Buicks anymore. But, he thought, just that at first. But what? But the moose are smaller now? But I'm tougher now? He shook his head, pushed the thoughts away, the sneaky thoughts, the ones that said he was hunting meat for food. Moose were made out of meat. He had a larger bow. Primitive people hunted moose with weapons like this. He was different now. He heard the sound again, a breaking limb, close, maybe 30 yards, and he crouched down and looked along the snow as he had for rabbits. There, a big brown leg moving, then another. Like small trees they were, suddenly moving small trees. He held his breath and crouched, watching. He could not see more of the moose, just the legs, and as he watched, they moved off to the left a bit, hesitated, then turned left again and started moving slowly, directly at him. Ah, he thought, there it is. Like it or not, I am about to hunt moose. His stomach tightened, and he stood and quickly glanced at his position. The brush was too thick for him to run, even if he had wanted to, and the truth was he didn't want to. He was different. He did have a better weapon, and there was a lot of meat on a moose. No room, he thought, to maneuver or to shoot. He moved his head to the right, and all he could see was thick brush, then to the left, and it was the same. No, there, a small opening, not 4 feet across and about 4 feet off the ground, almost a tunnel through the brush. But if it worked all worked exactly right, he might be able to get a shot. He moved to the left and stood facing the opening, leaned the killing lance against a nearby bush, held the bow up with the top tipped slightly to the right to keep it out of the brush. He put his best arrow on the string, ready to draw, and waited. And waited. Time seemed to stop. Somewhere to his left he heard the sound of a bird's wings, then the scratchy sound of a chickadee. Brush cracked directly in front of him, but he could see nothing. Another bird flew past. He aged, waiting, and now he heard the moose stepping, its hoofs shushing in the snow, and another breaking branch, and then a line. A curved line as the side of the moose's front end came into view in the tunnel. Brian tensed, his fingers tightening on the string. The edge of the shoulder moved slowly, ever so slowly, to the left, bringing more and more of the moose's chest into view. A third there, then a half, then 2/3, and then the whole chest. Brian drew the shaft back. A cow, his brain registered, a large cow moose, no antlers, a little spit dripping from the side of her mouth, brown eyes looking at him but not seeing him, or at least he hoped not. 20 feet, no more. 6-7 paces at the most. He released the bowstring. He could see it all later in his mind's eye, so it all must have registered, but when he did it, everything happened so fast, and yet incredibly slowly, that it all seemed one event. The arrow jumped from the string, and he saw the feathers fly straight away from him and at the moose and slam into the moose's neck just above the center of her chest. And in that instant, in that same split second, the moose caught the movement of the bow and arrow and Brian's head and charged so fast she almost met the arrow. If Brian had expected the brush to slow her down or the arrow striking her to handicap her, he was sadly mistaken. She was at him like a cat, so fast that she seemed a blur, and yet his mind took it all in. I hit her. The arrow hit her in the neck. She's charging at me. Another arrow. No time. The lance. That's it, the lance. He threw the bow aside and reached for the lance, all in one motion and all too late. He felt his hand clamp on the shaft of the lance, and at the same time she came out of the brush on top of him. He had one fleeting image of a wall of brown hair with the feathers of the arrow sticking out at the middle, and he went down. He would never know what saved him. She was gigantic and on him, and he thought she would crush him, mash him to the ground. But either the arrow hampered her movement or her momentum carried her too far, and she went on over Brian and had to turn and come back at him. He was hurt, his leg, his shoulder, yet he could move, and he rolled, still holding the killing lance, and came up to a kneeling position. He raised the head of the lance just as she hit him again. One image. She threw herself at him, her eyes red with rage, and he saw her run onto the lance, the point entering her chest just below the arrow. Then her head hit his forehead. Brian saw one flash of bright white light, as bright as all the snow, then nothing but pain and darkness. Chapter 10. A great weight. Something heavy on him. His mother was calling for him to come back. He was little again, a small boy and playing outside, and his mother was calling for him to come inside. But he couldn't move because there was a huge weight on him, holding him down, keeping him from coming home. Brian opened his eyes slowly, closed them against the brightness and the pain of his forehead, then opened them again. It was, he thought, the same world. Snow all around, bright sun, he was breathing, had a pounding pain in his forehead. It reminded him of the plane crash, and had what appeared to be an entire cow moose in his lap. He twitched when he looked down on her. Her eyes still looked mad, and her head plowed against his chest, but he realized she was dead. He started to examine his own situation. Nothing seemed to be broken. He could not at first believe this, and moved his arms and legs several times to make certain, then squirmed his way out from beneath the moose. She was lying half on him, her head on his chest, pushing him back, and when he stood it was the first time he got a long look at how big she was. From nose to back end, he guessed a good 8 or 9 feet, maybe more. He paced her off and came up with 4 paces in length, counting her legs, which were sticking out a bit, maybe 10 feet, and she was taller at the shoulder than he stood. He wondered for a moment if she was the same moose that attacked him earlier in the summer, and tried to feel that she was, tried to feel some animosity towards her. But the truth was that killing her made him sad. Elated and sad all at once, as he had been with the wolf-killed doe. She was ugly and beautiful at the same time, lying there in the snow, blood from her chest wounds smeared where she lay. An ugly, beautiful animal, and she was ended now. He had killed her, ended her life so that he could live, and he felt as bad as he felt good. He turned away for a moment, shook his head, and then turned back. There was much work to do, and for a moment he thought it would be impossible. It was perhaps half a mile back to camp, and there was absolutely no way he'd be able to drag her. He tried lifting a back leg, and it was all he could do to get it off the ground. Dragging her would be simply impossible. She must weigh 600 or 700 pounds. He would have to cut her up here and take her back to camp in pieces, and that nearly stopped him. How, he thought, do you cut a moose up? Never in all his life had he ever thought about cutting a moose into pieces. Where did he start? There were no dotted lines in the way there were in the diagram in the meat market. He thought on it a full 5 minutes, looking at her lying there, and finally realized he could do nothing until she was skinned. He used the knife to slit the hide from the neck, down the chest and belly to the back end. He had to cut around the lance, which had broken off after driving into her, and the arrow shaft still sticking out because they wouldn't pull free. The skin came away harder than with the doe, was thicker and had to be cut loose as he skinned, peeling it back a half inch at a time all along her body. When he cut along the belly, the knife slipped and cut the membrane holding the stomach in, and her guts fell out on his feet, steaming, and he went ahead and pulled them the rest of the way out, amazed at how much there was inside her. The liver alone weighed more than 2 rabbits, and he set it aside to cook later. With the guts out of her, she was easier to move. Still very hard, but some easier, and he quickly developed a rhythm for skinning. Pulling on the hide, slide the knife along. Pull, slide, pull, slide. In half an hour, he had lifted the hide completely off her right side, cutting it around the neck just under her head, and folded it over her back, completely exposing her right side. He had never, even in a butcher shop, seen so much meat in one place. She was a house of meat. Again, he lifted the back leg and couldn't move her, even with the guts out. But as he lifted the leg, he noted that there seemed to be a seam where the leg joined the body, a junction, and he put the knife there and cut, and the leg lifted away from the body. He kept lifting and cutting all around the top of the back leg, pushing up as he did so until it was joined only at the hip socket, which rotated freely, and he cut around the socket with the knife, and it popped loose, and the leg lifted completely away. Just that, her back leg was heavier than the doe, and he realized it would be hard to get the leg back to the shelter. This would be a long job. He decided to pull the leg back and then return to finish up. An all-night job, and it would be cold. He took off with the leg and used nearly 20 minutes just to pull it to the shelter, and was almost exhausted when he got there. He stored it along the wall and went back to where the body of the cow lay. It was now midday, and he was starving. He took 15 minutes to gather wood and start a fire near the carcass, and when it was blazing well, he cut a strip of meat from the rump, near where he'd lifted the leg off, and hung it over a stick so that it was nearly in the flames. He went back to cutting and skinning while it cooked. He cut away the right front shoulder. It lifted off much the same as the rear leg, the shoulder blade cutting away, and then the leg, and he dragged it back to camp. And when he returned, the meat on the stick was perfect, burned a little on the outside and cooked clear through. He cut pieces off and ate it standing there, looking down at the rest of the cow, and he thought he'd never tasted meat so good. It was better than deer or rabbit or fool birds, better than beef, and there was fat on it, more fat than the doe had, and he craved fat. Ate one piece of fat alone that was hanging on the side of the meat, and had cooked separately, and still craved it. He cut 2 large pieces of fat off the carcass and hung them over the fire to cook, while he went back to work. With the right legs gone, she was lighter, and by lifting the legs on the ground, he found he could just roll her over to get the uncompleted side. Once she was over, he skinned that side as he'd done the first one, working up the back after cutting around the legs until the hide was completely free of the carcass. Then he cut the legs loose, dragged them one at a time back to camp, and returned to the body of the moose in darkness. Finding his way was no problem, because there was a half moon and it lighted the snow into something close to daylight. But the cold came now, and he had no gloves. His hands chilled as he worked on the damp meat, and he had to warm them over the fire often, which slowed him. And by midnight, everything in him screamed to stop. But the cow was a treasure house of food and hide, and he wasn't about to leave her for the wolves, or the bear if it came along again, so he kept working. With the legs and rump gone, and the remaining part of the carcass was not too hard to handle. He used the hatchet to chop through the spine in 2 places and separated the back, middle, and front end, and it amazed him how much all animals were alike. She was immense, but the cow was built almost like a rabbit, with the same basic layout. The same design, he thought, grinning, and supposed if he were on all fours, he would look the same. He cut her head away with the hatchet and dragged the front section of her body, the rib cage, and the hump meat, and on top of her shoulders with it, back to the camp, and then the rear end and the center at the same time. That left only the hide and head. The head he could come back for tomorrow, and he set off with the hide at probably 4 a.m. It was the worst. It was staggeringly heavy. He couldn't lift it, and dragging it back to camp with his bow and arrows on top of it exhausted him. At camp, he looked at the pile of meat and hide next to his shelter wall, smiled once, shucked out of his rabbit skin shirt, crawled into his bag, and was in a deep, dreamless sleep in seconds. A good? No, he thought, his brain closing down. A great day. A meat day. A moose day. He would sketch it on the shelter wall tomorrow. All right, guys. Instead of answering questions today, if you're listening along this far, for a response, I want you to do a cave drawing of what you think you would be drawing, or what is Brian going to draw on his shelter wall tomorrow. Show me your version of Brian's shelter drawing of killing the moose.